Hello, good morning and good evening. This is Ashwin Mehta. I'm a co-director of Jack M. Wilson Center for Entrepreneurship at UMass Lowell. We are pleased to have you join this webinar on crowdfunding, research and practices as part of our global entrepreneurship education webinars. We are pleased to have Dr. Michael Susta, Associate Professor, Marketing, Entrepreneurship, and Innovation at Manning School of Business, present his research and number of years of experiences in the practices of crowdfunding. Dr. Sirsta is also the Program Director for Master of Science in Entrepreneurship at UMass Lowell. So with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Sirsta to discuss crowdfunding and research and practices. Michael?
Okay, thank you. Pull up my screen here. So do you see the main screen, or do you guys I have two screens here. So do you see my main screen, or do you see the
I see both, by the way.
You see both? Let me see if I can switch that over.
Okay, now it's
okay. How about now?
yes, great.
All right. So now I got that glitch squared away. Thank you, Ashwin, for welcoming me. Again, I'm Professor Michael Siuchta. I'm an associate professor here at the Manning School of Business in Lowell, Massachusetts, in the Marketing, Entrepreneurship, and Innovation Department. Again, I'll just give a very brief background. I had an undergraduate degree in economics at Cal Berkeley, and spent a couple years doing healthcare consulting, and then went and got my MBA in finance at the Wharton School, and then spent a number of years in industry doing corporate banking, commercial banking, work with large companies, small companies, entrepreneurs, in various different types of industries. And at some point, the bank I was with went through a series of mergers, and I thought, you know what, I want to do something that where I can take better control of my own life. So I decided to go back and get my PhD and enter academia. And so I've been here now. I think this is now my 6th year. I teach in entrepreneurship and innovation courses, and then I conduct research both in entrepreneurial finance and technology transfer. And so today I'm going to be talking about some of the research I've done in crowdfunding. And then I'm also going to give you an overview of an activity I do in the classroom. So again, just a brief agenda here. I'll give sort of an overview of crowdfunding. I'm going to admit up front, I'm going to be really focusing on the US context. That's the one I'm most familiar with. Then I will start doing it. I'll provide a pretty brief and very broad summary of some basic crowdfunding research findings, not necessarily my own, but just in general, what people have uncovered in this relatively new context. And then I'll go into a little bit more detail on 2 of my studies. And then I'll, as I mentioned, spend some time talking about how I use crowdfunding as an activity for my students in my entrepreneurial finance course. And then lastly, open it up to any questions that you might have, and hopefully I can address those. So again, briefly, I don't really know what people's backgrounds are, if you're familiar with crowdfunding or not, but to give you a sort of a broad definition, it's a means by which individuals can go and solicit funds from a crowd of contributors, and these contributors in turn are making generally relatively small financial donations or investments, and they're doing this through a crowdfunding platform, through some intermediary, which now is on the internet. And so again, it's this unaffiliated crowd. So typically these are strangers to you, although as I'll discuss, not always. And generally that's what you expect. You may have an unsuccessful campaign. It's a pretty big range of funding now. So why people are interested in this from an entrepreneurial standpoint is that this really does open up a whole new financial landscape for potential entrepreneurs. So many entrepreneurs have limited funds. Most entrepreneurs have limited funds initially, and they may have tapped their own personal savings. They may have a limited network of friends and family they can go to. And so there was, at least in the US, there's really had been, and actually many other places, this huge gap between what you potentially get through your own personal network and then going to more traditional sources of funding, such as angel investors or banks or venture capitalists. And so that really was where people who really were proponents of crowdfunding saw it as a sweet spot. Really, it was going to enable entrepreneurs to really attract a whole new type of funding to finance their ventures. And it has done that. It's these numbers I'm showing you are not just for new business entrepreneurs, but as I'll talk about, other types of funding also. But it's a pretty big and significant means of financial activity right now. And so we're talking about in the billions of dollars across all different platforms and across different countries as well. Again, sort of in the US, this really came about online, which is when we talk about crowdfunding, that's really what we're talking about now, really since 2008. And it was a relatively small activity at first, but as you can see, it's expanded quite significantly since then. But the general concept of a person raising funds from a crowd of people that they don't know in relatively small denominations is not a new phenomenon by itself. And so, in fact, there's a couple sort of well-known anecdotes of how this has happened in the past. And one in the US here was how this is, if you can't tell, this is a picture of the Statue of Liberty, which is outside New York City. And apparently what had happened is they had achieved the funds to construct and install the statue itself, but they didn't necessarily have the necessary funds for the pedestal upon which the statue was going to be placed. And so a publisher for the newspaper went out and did a general solicitation for funds from the New York community to raise funds in order to be able to afford to put the pedestal in the water there. Otherwise, they might have lost it to another location. So as I mentioned, there are various different types of what we call crowdfunding models. And these basically refer to the different types or mechanisms by which the funder is going to solicit funds and the type of interest that the donor or contributor is going to receive in the entity itself. And so the simplest way is really what we call a donation-based model. And in this model, it's just kind of like it sounds. The crowd will give money just because they want to support a particular cause. And so some well-known websites that cater to this are things like CrowdFize and CrowdRise, GoFundMe, and Razoo. And so again, this would be an example where someone may need funds because they want to go on a vacation, they've got health problems, they need to buy a car, they want to support a particular charity. These types of activities, you would go through one of these donation-based models, which for an entrepreneur may not probably would not be one of your primary sources of funding to go this route. Second, we have what are called reward-based models. And in these, you as the donor, you in exchange for your contribution, your financial contribution, what you get is some type of reward. And typically there will be a tiering of rewards. And so in some cases, you start out in the US, typically you start at say a $5 reward level, and you would get just maybe a mere thank you. But at some point, you might actually get the product itself. So it serves basically as a prepayment mechanism. So this one is very valuable for entrepreneurs who particularly have a product or service that they can offer up as a sort of a pre-sale mechanism. And it does vary in terms of what kind of projects could be funded across different types of platforms. It also depends, different platforms have different models. So in some cases, we have what's called an all or nothing, which if you don't hit your target, you don't get any of the funds. And that's something that Kickstarter adopts. Whereas you have what's called, so Kickstarter would be one of the bigger ones here. That's all or nothing. Indiegogo doesn't work that way. So Indiegogo, you get what you raise. So even if you don't hit your goal, you get the amount that you raise. Then you have, so that's reward based. Then you've got what's called peer-to-peer lending, and just kind of like it sounds, this is where you borrow from a crowd. So this now, in fact, you are taking out loans. You, the entrepreneur, will be taking out loans, and these, because it's a loan, you have to pay it back. And so here are a couple examples of some of the more prominent peer-to-peer peer-to-peer lending sites. And finally, we get equity-based. So in exchange for contributions, you, the donor, get actually ownership in the company. You actually get equity in the company. And so again, some of the more prominent websites that focus on the equity-based model are WeFunder, Crowdcube, AngelList, and so on and so forth. So those are the brief description of the various types of models. And then here are some stats that Massolution is an entity that tracks a lot of crowdfunding activity. And you can see here by the different types of campaign size that on the donation and reward base, at least US standards, these are US investment standards, these are relatively small. So the average reward or contribution is about $3,000, or the actual campaign is about $3,000. People are actually contributing around the average around $50, but the average campaign is raising about $3,000. But you can see that when you get to the equity-based models, and the average campaign size is actually pretty significant. So it can be real money to really support the growth and funding for an entrepreneurial venture. Okay, in the US, what we've had recently is, so I've talked about the different types of models. The most recent one that's gained some prominence is an equity-based model. And that really came about from this Jumpstart Our Business Startups Act, which President Obama signed back in 2012. And this now allows entrepreneurs to raise equity from non-accredited investors. So typically you could raise money as an entrepreneur, but you really were limited to, there were ways to get around it, but by and large, you're really limited to having to raise funds from accredited investors. And so these are certain entities like banks, trusts, and things like that, but also wealthy individuals and pretty high income thresholds. So an income over $200,000 or net worth over $1 million. So the idea is that you were financially, had those kinds of resources, you could withstand any kind of loss that you might incur by making investment in some of these entities. So then there's titles in the act. We'll go into a lot of detail about all of them, but just the main ones are in Title II. This would now allow companies to make what are called general solicitations, or basically open calls. So you could now start to advertise on things like billboards, to the extent anybody does that anymore. More likely what you'd be doing is advertising through social media and on your website. So this, prior to this, you couldn't make these general solicitations. But now through this Jobs Act Title II, you're allowed to do this on websites and through social media. But still, you can only really do this to accredited investors. So you had to, again, focus your efforts, your fundraising efforts on wealthy individuals or institutions. But then you had Title III, which really is the one that has gained the most prominence. We call this one Crowdfund Act, or Regulation Crowdfund. This now establishes rules in which you can now raise funds from the general public. So you're no longer restricted to just going to accredited investors. You do need to go through some of these intermediaries. So, and these would be these funding portals like WeFunder, Crowdcube, things like that I mentioned. These are now professionally developed specifically for this purpose. And there are now restrictions put in place to protect the investors. So you have income restrictions as to how much you can invest as an investor. And so you can see some of the thresholds right there. And again, that's the idea that we want to somewhat protect investors to the extent possible, because they're really moving into a new area here where they're making investments in private companies that they really had not had access to prior to this. So I'm focusing primarily so far on crowdfunding in the US. I'm not going to say a whole lot about crowdfunding outside the US, just because mostly it's not my area of expertise. And it's not as well known, it's not as well established. But I will give this caveat: if there are people out there in the audience who have an interest in crowdfunding, and certainly from a research standpoint, I'm very interested and open to exploring potential research opportunities that might come up in some of these other contexts. So for instance, in China, some interesting things that are different in China, at least that I'm aware of, that relative to the U.S., is you do have you have the role of these large e-commerce companies like JD and Alibaba, who are investing in crowdfunding portals themselves. You don't see something like that happening here in the U.S. And typically on the equity side, they do more of what's called a leader-follower model, where you have prominent investors, institutional investors also investing, and then you have smaller investors investing alongside them. So again, that's something you see a little bit in the US, but it's not as prominent as it is in China. In India, you got sort of a whole different story now, where it's really more of an emerging concept. And this is a relatively recent paper I was reading about. So that you've got a lot of institutional issues in India So where you have to issues about trust, issues about familiarity with e-commerce, cybersecurity. So these are all things that any country or institution that's looking to institute crowdfunding needs to be able to grapple with. Also, you need to make distinctions between whether this is a private or a public security, and then if, depending on which one it is, which entity is going to oversee it. So it could be the Securities Exchange Board of India or the Ministry of Corporate Affairs. So these, again, have different oversight responsibilities depending on what type of security it is. But again, it's very interesting to think about potentially studying this emerging in India because it is such a nascent context right now. Okay, so I'm going to move on. Again, I'm blowing through this relatively quickly. I'm going to now talk about some general research findings that people who have studied crowdfunding, what they've uncovered. One thing is that you'll see there's different platforms that are better suited for different types of projects. So if you have what's like a consumer-based product or company or services-oriented company that really works well on a reward-based platform. On the other hand, if what you're doing is more technological, hard science, or technology that's going to take a little while to develop, it may be more difficult because you don't have necessarily the rewards that to offer up in that context. Similarly, you'll see that if you're looking at donation-based, so this is again appealing to causes. For some reason, I don't know the necessary reason for this, but environmental projects don't seem to fare as well as some other projects. Cultural projects can be successful. In fact, some of the most successful projects have been cultural projects, but it is very idiosyncratic to that project. And they, as you might expect, depend very much on the whims of the public taste. So it can be sometimes hard to gauge what the public is going to like. But on the other hand, there's been some interesting research that looks at, from arts-based projects, how well the public is, how well they are at sort of predicting projects in terms of their artistic appeal. So this one study looked at how the crowd viewed projects, and then it also put those same projects in front of some artistic experts, and they found that the public taste actually mapped pretty well onto the experts. So maybe the public actually does do a pretty good job at discovering talent and quality. Also, one of the most prominent findings looking at that people have uncovered looking at crowdfunding is that social capital matters. So your network matters. So this is maybe not such great news for a lot of people who are getting into crowdfunding because they think it's a good way to raise funds if they've got a limited network themselves. On the one hand, that's certainly an appeal for it, but it doesn't really always play out that way. So oftentimes you would think that you could open your fundraising efforts to a much more geographically diverse network, but it oftentimes doesn't work out that way. In fact, it shows findings have been shown that it's actually much more geographically clustered around where the venture is located than you might expect. And then people's personal networks also matter a lot. So we tend to measure it on things like social network connections. So one study looked at Facebook connections, and again found if you had 10 friends, then at the time you launch, you had about 9% chance of succeeding. But you see, as your number of your friends goes up, your chances go up quite a bit. So at 100, you had a 20% chance of being successful. If you had 1,000 friends on Facebook, then you actually had a 40% chance, holding everything else equal, 40% chance of being successful. So similar to social capital, your human capital, so what you as an individual bring in terms of your own skills and abilities matters to how successful you'll be. So some things you want to signal as an entrepreneur is that you have competence, you're highly competent, your entrepreneurial competence, and then also that you're trustworthy. Maybe more than anything else, you want to demonstrate somehow or signal that your trustworthiness, and you also want to then maybe signal you're committed to the venture. And so this one way to do this, one study looked at what the type of model you chose. So this all or nothing, like the Kickstarter model, or the Keep It All, which is more like the Indiegogo model, and found that one way to signal you were committed to the project was you volunteered to go with this all or nothing concept. So funders would see that you're really committed to it because they know if you're not successful raising the funds you asked for, you won't get anything. Other things, so actually one of the very positives about crowdfunding is that it has opened up the funding landscape much more to females who have traditionally been way underrepresented in terms of getting institutional funds like angel venture capital. On the other hand, females actually tend to do better than males in the crowdfunding context. Generally, though, unfortunately, not so well for other minorities like African Americans. Studies have looked at this and found that they necessarily don't, they're not as successful, and they also don't necessarily get equivalent terms when you're looking sort of like a lending-based model, again, taking everything else equal. Also, then what you say on your on your campaign matters a lot. So how you phrase what you're looking for. So you can, again, some studies have looked at whether you frame it as something called like a results in progress. That's how you would construct your narrative. So you have some slow progression of accomplishments. Again, these are sort of generic terms I'm giving to you, but it's a broad way of thinking about how you would frame your narrative versus you portray it as an ongoing journey. So on the one hand, this is where you tap into this sense of community and certain contributors, especially if you're going for more of a product-oriented company, a basic product, or maybe an artistic product, then the sense of community can be very important. So again, how you frame your project can be very important. Some studies have looked at whether you frame it around sustainability orientation versus commercial orientation, or whether you frame it around social orientation versus profit orientation. And basically, these studies show that these things matter. So depending on, again, it very much depends on the type of project that you're launching. Something else is other studies have looked at what motivates funders in this context. And so for rewards-based, they obviously want to collect. They want to collect the rewards. They see it as important. They want to help others. Again, as I mentioned, they have this sense of wanting to be part of a community and support a cause. Equity-based, actually these people really are interested in getting a financial return. So they're not as motivated by some of the more altruistic things that you see when people are contributing on rewards-based campaigns. In fact, rewards in this context may not be that particularly helpful. Finally, some people are looking, and this will get to some of the two studies I'm going to mention that I've done, kind of concerned about what kind of risks funders are being exposed to. So we do find that outright fraud, where someone who's doing a crowdfunding campaign actually is fraudulent from the get-go, is relatively rare, and there are some instances of it, but it is rare. But at the same time, it's hard to detect because it doesn't always get reported, and so it's hard to know exactly how much of it is actually taking place. But you do see that these delayed projects are actually very commonplace, and then failed projects where they don't necessarily they have good intentions, but they just can't come to pull off what they had promised, are actually fairly commonplace. And this actually becomes the case when you've got very successful projects. It's almost a two-edged sword. On the one hand, it's great you've been so successful at your project. But on the other hand, now you've got to turn around and distribute maybe thousands of a product that you had no real plan how to do. So you now need to source it, distribute it, and it becomes much more challenging to the entrepreneur than they had envisioned. And then you also see that herding effects are pretty rampant. So what that means is that the crowd tends to follow the crowd. So that can lead people to make some unwise decisions, and that'll tap into specific research I'm going to talk about. So let's get into that. So I'm going to talk very briefly about two projects I did, two papers I did on crowdfunding. And both of these are, well, one of them had a combination of different methods, but primarily these are I'm using an experimental approach where we design experiments and we want to test some of these underlying causal mechanisms about how people make decisions in this context. And so in this first one, what we're really interested in is what the impact of certain what we call information cues. So the things that people see on these websites, how do they react to those? How do they make decisions about what they see on websites for these crowdfunding campaigns? And then more importantly, then does that depend on some other personal attributes an individual might have? And so the one we're really interested in when we talk about information cues, we're really talking two things that we manipulate in this study as we look at the venture quality. So a good venture or not so good venture, and then social information. So that's the way we describe that is we manipulate whether the crowd has expressed favorable opinions about it, or a lot of other people who have invested in this entity. That would be favorable or unfavorable. They express negative opinions about it, or they just haven't done a lot of donating to this entity. And then we look at what's called the investor's regulatory focus. So most people are governed by, they approach decisions with some specific regulatory, self-regulatory framework. And generally the two ways people approach some decisions are through what's called a promotion focus, where you strive for advancement and aspirations, and you're really focusing on positive aspects of feedback. And then when you do this, you avoid accident. So you tend to be a go-getter, and your bigger fear is that you're going to pass up something that you should not have passed up on. On the other hand, there are people who adopt decision-making framework through a prevention focus, where now you're more governed by duties and obligations, and here you want to tend to avoid errors of commission. So here you're really afraid of doing the wrong thing, and so here you tend to focus on negative and feedback from the environment. What we find here is that the most unexpected thing we find, well, first we find that people do respond to these cues as you would expect. So good ideas people pursue, bad ideas people tend to avoid, people follow the crowd. One interesting thing is that people, though, follow the crowd perhaps a bit more than they should. What we mean by that is that you can take what we call a bad idea, but you throw some positive social information around it, and people will herd towards that bad idea, as opposed, and they'll kind of view that more favorably than they would an otherwise good idea, even though it may have some negative crowd noise around it. So that's one thing. The second thing is that what was unexpected is we find that the prevention-oriented people really responded to the social information much more than we thought they would, and particularly the positive social information. So how we saw that these people are really governed by what we call a fear of missing out. So there's this notion when you've got a lot of people making investments that other potential investors are looking at that social information, and they're seeing that there's a good opportunity that they're afraid to miss out on. And so even though they, in their own better judgment, may not really believe that it's a great investment, they have this overriding fear of missing out, and that prompts them into making these potentially bad investments. Similarly, we then look at another study where we're kind of playing on the same kinds of concepts. So the idea that we're trying to really uncover here is how, in this context, might people make decisions that aren't always the best. So the general notion around crowdfunding is great. It's seen as I mentioned, a way for entrepreneurs to raise funds, and it's a way for people to make investments in entities that they would not have been able to make before. And it's generally seen as a very positive win-win for both the entrepreneurs and the funders. And what we're trying to do with some of this research is, that's all well and good, but there may be some causes for concern. And so we want to really see if we can understand those better. And so in this one, we introduced this concept of crowd bias, which is this tendency for people, like I mentioned in the previous study, where now they're following the opinions of the crowd in the presence, and specifically when the objective quality is saying they really shouldn't be doing that. And the concept that we play up on here is self-efficacy. And self-efficacy is generally one's belief that in your own ability to be successful in a particular task. So you may have high engineering self-efficacy, you may have high acting self-efficacy, you may have general knowledge self-efficacy, or you will just have high belief in your own abilities in a particular context. And generally, this is seen as a good thing. Generally, people who are higher in self-efficacy tend to do better on certain tasks. But there is potentially a downside to it. And in this case, it is that your high self-efficacy means you also, at the same time, may tend to take shortcuts. So you tend to exert less cognitive effort on things just because you think you're generally good at them. So you don't necessarily see that you need to put that much effort into certain things. And in this context in particular, that can be a bad thing, because what we look at is that when you have higher self-efficacy, then you will tend to put less effort into investigating the underlying merits of a crowdfunding campaign. And so in particular, we're saying you can actually search less. So higher self-efficacy, you search less, you seek out less information about these entities that are whose securities you'd be investing in on this website, and then you actually make poor decisions. And that's what we found in this study. And that you not only that was bad, but then also you're also likely to exert less cognitive effort by also following the crowd. So again, the presence of crowd noise and the presence of high self-efficacy if you have those two kind of factors taking place, could result in some pretty poor decisions on the part of investors potentially making investments on these websites. So what can you about these things? What you may want to do is just raise people's awareness that about the crowd effect in general. You may want to call into attention to them then, so that their self-efficacy might not be as high as they think it is. So it's not like you don't have to take tests prior to making these investments or things like that. But these websites do need to think about the certain biases that these investors are going to be exhibiting and falling prey to when they're making investments on these websites. And we can maybe discuss that more in the Q&A part if people have questions about that. But if you do have general questions on, there's a whole bunch of research on crowdfunding. It's a fairly new context. Here's a book that came out recently, which I had the opportunity to write one chapter in, and it synthesizes a bunch of great, interesting findings on crowdfunding. So what I want to do now, Ben, is just turn briefly to how I've incorporated this into the classroom. Here's an article that was written up about a few years ago now about this when I first started doing this activity. So that's me there. And I think we moved buildings. That was in our old building. And there's a brief article. And what I've done is I've recognized that crowdfunding can create a great learning opportunity for students. So clearly they can, as an entrepreneur, they have to go out and raise funds. And it's not something anybody is going to ever really be that comfortable with. But there's no way to actually know what that experience is like until you have to actually go out and do it. So I've tried to bring that as much as I possibly can into the classroom, where I can then also have some social good for the community in which we're located. And so what I've done, and as I mentioned, there's different types of models of crowdfunding campaigns. I've gone for my class activity, I have them do a donation-based activity. So the students and teams have to identify a local, which will be in the Lowell area, a nonprofit or a charity. And here are some of the ones that they've identified in the past. So you've got things like the Humane Society, Boys and Girls Club, Lowell Association for the Blind. So they have to go out and reach out to one of these communities, and then they have to design a crowdfunding campaign to actually try and go out and raise funds for that entity. And that's what so that means they actually have to do something. And so here are a couple examples where they've gone out and accessed their own social networks, sort of posting things on Facebook, depending on which platform, right? So that's the picture on the left. On the one on the right, there's a campaign on a particular platform. And so here I choose these platforms, and they have to actually build a campaign page. They have to create a video. They've got to do updates and things like that. And so they try and raise money in the course of about 30 days each campaign lasts. And here then some quotes from that article that I flashed up there a couple of screens ago. So this one is one that I gave, and it's kind of my overall motivation for why I wanted to do this in the first place. And I'm saying it's a finance class, so they do plenty of work with spreadsheets and numbers and things like that. But what I want to emphasize is, as an entrepreneur, that's not the hard part of finance. Doing numbers and spreadsheets and things like that, coming up with forecasts, that's fairly cut and dry. The hard part is actually going on and raising the funds. And so real life interactions with real people. And it's not something people are typically comfortable with, and maybe requires you to step out of your comfort zone. So I want to make sure that they get some exposure to that. And then here's a couple of quotes from some of the students who had to do this. So I've done it at the MBA level, the master's level, also the undergraduate level. So she said she was impressed with the ease of setting up the campaign. So again, setting up the campaign is not that hard to do. But she said the effective advertising proved to be the biggest challenge. They advertised on social media, they did flyers, sent emails, but still didn't raise nearly the amount that they had hoped to raise. The biggest takeaway from the project is that raising money is difficult using any medium. So welcome to entrepreneurial finance. Similarly, another student said it was an amazing activity. He's grateful for the amount of expertise I brought, for the fact that this is my favorite part, that I wouldn't just give them the answers. I made them chase out the answers until we understood that. And the reason I do that is because I don't have the answers, right? So I don't know what's necessarily going to be successful or not. I can tell you generally, again, what research has shown in terms of how you construct a campaign. But at the end of the day, a lot of it comes down to the particular personal appeal that the person makes, how diligent they are. And so it's important for them to go out and uncover, to the extent there are answers to be uncovered, that they go out and uncover those answers themselves and don't leave it to me to provide it for them. And again, last thing I will say is that it has been, for the students, it's very good, but at the same time, it has made what I'd like to think some dent in these local communities. So all told, now over a few years I've been doing this, we've raised slightly over $2,400 for these local areas and nonprofits. So that's about what I have. So I'd be happy to take any questions, comments you might have at this point. Thanks.
Mike, let me just do the concluding remarks and then turn it over to the questions. Sridhar, can I show my screen? Sridhar? Okay, thank you. So thank you, Mike, for an excellent discussion on the crowdfunding. I just wanted to go over a couple of the webinars that we have planned for the next few weeks. The next webinar will be on November 7th. We'll talk about the emerging technologies and what the entrepreneurial opportunities are created through that. So that could also be very much integral part of any entrepreneurship education that you all can have. The second webinar, which is quite interesting, is what can we learn from nature, and that's on biomimicry, new ways of teaching entrepreneurship. It's going to be on November 13th. And we're going to be closing out this fall semester with the last webinar that will be end of November. That will be dealing with the social media or the digital media and how entrepreneurs can use it. So our purpose of these webinars have been to kind of provide knowledge, share the knowledge that we have accumulated over the years, just what Professor Srista just mentioned, and share that with the other faculty so that you can use that in your classrooms. We welcome your feedback. Please send us any comment that you have. We will be sending out a short survey shortly to solicit your input about the future webinars that you think you would be interested in. And we'll try to organize that schedule in the next couple of months so that you can plan your spring calendar accordingly. With that, we will turn over to your questions. Sridhar, are you collecting the questions or make it open?
There are a few questions. If you can open up the questions tab in your control panel. Do you see them?
I don't see any.
I don't see any questions. I opened the tab.
Yeah, go ahead, Mike.
I don't see any.
Yeah, so the question is,
are there questions?
Let me read the question. This crowdfunding will help for only social cause, but how for it helps new startups? So basically, how can crowdfunding help the new startups?
Yeah, so it's not by any means, it's not a specifically for social causes. In fact, the biggest successes have been for commercially oriented products. So one of the first ones that came out was what's called the Pebble. These were done through Kickstarter campaigns. So these were like a Pebble watch, and we're talking about $10 million they raised. Another really hugely successful one was something called the Coolest Cooler. It was basically, and if I had more time, it's actually a video I show in class. If you can Google it's Coolest Cooler. It's basically a cooler, but he incorporated a bunch of things like a battery charger, different trays, lamps, special wheels. He raised about $12 million. So it's definitely something that can be done for commercial products. Now, those again are something that's geared around a product. If you have something that's not, if it's earlier stage technology or you don't think there's going to be a specific product, then you might want to think about the equity crowdfunding, right? So that's really, then you're selling equity to investors in your company. So again, as I mentioned, the average raises on those is now maybe the hundreds of thousands of dollars. So you can definitely get a fair amount, a fair amount of funding through that, where you don't necessarily even have, you're not going for a call. You're a for-profit entity, but you may not have a specific product that you're trying to get funds to a pre-sale for.
Okay, we have another question. I'm not sure I can read the whole question there. It's truncated, but it says crowdfunding strategies will, I think it's more of a comment, I believe. It's crowdfunding strategies will have to be different for different geographies. And I don't have the remaining, but yeah, you're right. Mike, you want to expand on that? The funding
Yeah,
strategy.
that's right. That's true. So again, it depends. As I said up front, I'm most familiar with the context in the U.S. market. So, and it's not even, hasn't really been around in the U.S. that long, but it's grown quite significantly since then. So it is important that you take into consideration the rules, regulations in your own particular market or country. So as I mentioned, in China, that it's often done much differently than it is here in the U.S. Similarly, in India, at least the limited understanding I have of it is that it's much earlier in developmental stages. And I think there are a lot of the questions they're grappling with. So if you are, I would encourage you, if you're in either of those two countries, you have to do a bit of due diligence on your own to find out exactly what the proper steps you would need to take. And you're right, there are certain products or certain products or services that might be not as well suited for your particular context.
Okay, there's one more question here, but again, it's coming truncated. I'm not sure why. Sridhar, can you help me in that?
There
It says
should be
highly.
a button on the top where you can open up the window.
I'm sorry?
There should be a button called undock pane, and you can open up the window and stretch it out.
Oh, yes, sorry, thank you. Yeah. So the next question, Mike, is highly instructive and valuable. Thank you. Can you put into context the stage of project and how that matches with the crowdfunding on the continuum of financing a venture? I'm thinking about seed, angel, Series A, etc. Good question.
Yeah, that's a great question. So one of the things that crowdfunding can do is so I would, in general, it's going to be more in line with early stage funding. So earliest stage funding. So meaning yourself, the entrepreneur, friends and family. And oftentimes crowdfunding works as a stepping stone and important signaling mechanism to attract later stage funding like angel funding or venture capital. So that's one of the benefits of doing crowdfunding, which I really didn't mention, but I'm glad this person raised the question, is it can act as a very high quality signal to a future investor that you've got something worth investing in. In fact, this work has done that. But it doesn't always work that way. So there are actually, in fact, a number of crowdfunding successful campaigns where the person has actually, this is actually another study I've done, which I didn't talk about, but where they either could have gone out and raised angel or venture capital funding, and sometimes they do, but then they also go and raise equity crowdfunding instead. And there's different reasons for that, but so you may ask, why would someone want to go and, if they can go and raise venture capital or angel funding, why would they go raise equity crowdfunding instead? One of the things equity crowdfunding you don't get is potentially the high value added that you would get sort of like with a venture capitalist and possibly an angel. But the flip side is that it tends to be easier, it tends to be faster. So if you don't really, if you don't necessarily need that expertise, you don't need that experts, the networks or the industry expertise that a venture capitalist or potentially an angel investor would bring to you, like if you've got experience yourself, then it actually might make sense for you to bypass those more traditional financing mechanisms and go to something like equity crowdfunding. But generally, it's going to work before you go and raise seed money from a professional investor or later stage money.
Okay, the next question is from Sanjay Gadale. a college incubation department seeking crowdfunding, how will you help such ecosystem? What would be the best way?
So there are different. I actually, so I haven't done this myself, but I have colleagues at other institutions where they actually, all the efforts I've done have been through as I mentioned, the classroom activities, the donation-based model. But I do know of other professors who actually do conduct classes where they have people do actually more like a Kickstarter campaign. So in order to do that, the person really has to have a viable product or service. And so I think you could definitely incorporate this into an incubator space, but you, again, as you would be applying to an incubator, you might also then be applying to whether or not because not everybody's going to have something that is a viable crowdfunding project. So I think it could be part of the, if you want to incorporate into the incubator, certainly could be something that an incubator could assist their the firms in the incubator in doing in terms of doing crowdfunding campaigns, or it may just also be an additional selection criteria you would incorporate when you evaluate potential firms coming into an incubator. If you think this is going to be an element of the service that an incubator provides, then some entities that come into the incubator will be better suited for crowdfunding campaigns than others. As I mentioned, entities that have a closer product focus or service focus might be a little bit easier to do crowdfunding campaigns around than something that's very earlier stage technology, where our platform type technology, where there's no immediate or there's near-term commercial applications that are obvious yet.
The other question. Okay, if people who funded get loss of money, what are the solutions for that? Obviously, there's a level of risk that any funder takes in such thing. So it's a personal risk situation. You have to assess that, and I think Mike covered some of the equity-based.
Yeah, so that is again it's a sort of a novel area because at least I'm not a lawyer, but as I've read a little bit of lawyers who talk about this, as with a lot of the law gets established based on precedent, and so for a lot of these things, it's unprecedented. So one of the issues is, and I teach it in the class. So if you're thinking about investing or contributing to a crowdfunding campaign, try and do as much due diligence as you can up front. So you can, as a potential investor or funder, make sure you ask a lot of questions. So even though it's not like you're doing investing in a seed round or Series A round, as an investor in these, you can do some due diligence. You can ask some questions. If you find that the person is unresponsive or they're vague in their answers, maybe an indication you want to back away. But if the question is what can you do in terms of recourse, unfortunately, oftentimes there's not much. So some of the more well-known ones that were, if they're outright fraud, then the government potentially gets involved, and it's in the U.S., the SEC or someone will go after them. But even that, you as the investor may not get much, because generally these there isn't much behind these. So if someone did a crowdfunding campaign for a particular type of product, and the product generally it's not going to be fraud, but generally they meant to do well. It just turns out they were in over their heads. They couldn't deliver as they expected, and then you don't necessarily have any recourse to them. I mean, you can try and go after them, but you were talking about small dollars that you invested anyway, and the chances are they don't really have anything. Otherwise, they wouldn't. That's one of the reasons why they went out of business or folded. So unfortunately, oftentimes people do, as an investor or contributor, if it is going to be unsuccessful, there's not much recourse you can do.
There's a request for to send a presentation to our mails. Yes, we will do that. We also have a link to the video that will be available to you. As a matter of fact, on our website, you can see all the past webinars, videos, and if you like the hard copy or the presentation, copy, just send us an email. We'll be more than happy to send you the copy there. Question that Mike, you said the science and technology is difficult for crowdfunding. Is it ballpark 5% or even lower? Secondly, whether
That's a great question. I don't know empirically. I mean, I suppose I could. I'm sure I could find some information on that. On the top of my head, I don't know. But again, it's the reason it's difficult is so technology can do fairly well. The technology, if it's tied to a specific product, tends to do better. So again, on these reward based, generally that's what people want. They want the reward. So like I mentioned, the cooler was an example. You know, the Pebble Watch was an example where there was a very specific product. Oculus Rift, which was one of the bigger ones first, was a virtual headset. Was very successful, and they did a successful Kickstarter campaign. That company then sold out to Facebook for billions of dollars. So very successful. So there's definitely technology embedded in, but it's embedded in a very specific product. So it's harder. Let's say if you were a faculty member doing basic research, or even research, basic or applied research that's not necessarily linked to a specific product. Those are just more challenging. And but I will say there are websites, crowdfunding portals that are catered more towards that specific type of funding. So maybe you have to go investigate those a little bit more closely. Again, I'm not that familiar with those. But it probably is a number I could quantify if I had some time digging it up, but off the top of my head, I don't know.
Another question is, can we collect funds from the alumni industries and trusts for hostel construction and maintenance? This is obviously it's been around for a long time. It's a crowdfunding platform, can offer a lot more efficiency and can save a lot of time. So absolutely, this is an ideal crowd target that you can go after.
And you were saying real estate is real estate. If I understood the question correctly, real estate is one of the areas that has been growing the most, and so a lot of the figures they almost track those separately. So I haven't really gone into detail on real estate transactions, but that is one of the areas where crowdfunding is actually growing the fastest and is the biggest.
Yeah, it's another attendee had commented that the group of industrialists and landlords and business people collected funds and created an association to establish an engineering college. They continue to make requests for further donations. So that definitely is a ideal target for education type of projects there. And it's been around for decades, if not centuries. I think that's all we have. Any other question, comments? Anyone want to make any comments in the audience? Well, with that, thank you so much for attending. Again, these information about our website, you can go to Global Entrepreneurship Exchange website, uml.edu/GE2, where you can get a lot of information about our educational program. And then you can go to our Center for Entrepreneurship website, uml.edu/Wilson-Center, where you can find these recordings of webinars from the past 7 webinars. So this concludes our webinar 8, and we look forward to your attendance at the next webinars on November 7th. And thank you so much for attending this one, and have a good day.